In this video, I will be boring you to sleep by reading through some documents that I have from my anatomy class that I took a couple years ago. Question number 1. What is the general function shared by the nervous system and endocrine system? Describe how each system accomplishes that function differently. What are advantages and disadvantages of the way each system carries out the function? Answer number 1. The nervous and endocrine systems are both used in communication and control throughout the body. The nervous system communicates via electrical impulses along nerve cells. These impulses are super rapid, reaching up to 150 meters per second for nerve fibers with a myelin sheath. The response is immediate but shuts off when the impulses stop. The endocrine system communicates by releasing hormones via the glands that travel through the bloodstream and bind target tissues. This form of communication is much slower than the nervous system, but the response is prolonged for minutes, hours, or even days. Question 2. What is the detailed three-part function of the nervous system? Provide as much detail as possible, including any relevant pathways. Answer number 2. The nervous system is responsible for sensory input, integration, and motor output. Millions of sensory receptors monitor internal and external changes, or stimuli. This gathered information is called sensory input. This info is sent along the afferent pathway, sensory nerves, to the control center. Somatic sensory nerves convey info from the somatic sensory neurons located in the skin, skeletal muscles, and joints to the brain, while visceral sensory nerves convey info from visceral sensory neurons located in visceral organs. In this case, the control center is the central nervous system, or CNS. Here, integration takes place, the process of interpreting sensory input and deciding an appropriate response. This response is called motor output. It is sent along the efferent pathway, motor nerves, and activates effector organs such as muscles and glands to carry out the response. Somatic motor nerve fibers conduct impulses from the CNS to skeletal muscles, while visceral motor nerve fibers regulate activity of smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. Question number 3. List the two different branches of the autonomic nervous system. Rate the function of each branch. Describe 3 responses that occur in the body when each branch is activated and the purpose of each response. Answer number 3. One subdivision of the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic division. Since these types of responses are usually associated with emergency reactions, it is also known as the fight or flight response. It helps mobilize body systems during activity. The following are examples of sympathetic responses. Accelerated heart rate so that more nutrients and oxygen can get to muscles faster, dilation of the pupils of the eyes so that more light can enter for better vision, relaxation of the bronchi in the lungs so that the expansion allows more oxygen intake for cellular respiration, and inhibition of stomach and intestinal activity so that precious nutrients and oxygen are used for the skeletal muscles. The second subdivision of the autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic division. These responses are associated with rejuvenation of the body, which mainly involves digestion. This mainly occurs during rest. The following are examples of parasympathetic responses. Stimulation to salivary glands to lubricate food for easy swallowing and start the digestion of carbohydrates. Amylase breaks down sugars. Stimulations of stomach and intestinal activity for the digestion of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Stimulation of pancreas activity to produce enzymes involved with food digestion. Protein enzyme equals trypsin, fat protein equals lipase, carbohydrate enzyme equals amylase, and stimulation of the gallbladder to release bile to aid in breaking down fats. Question number 4. Describe the structure of nerves and tracts. What are the differences between nerves and tracts? Answer number 4. Nerves and tracts have the same basic structure, bundles of axons enclosed in connective tissue that contain blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. However, nerves are located outside the CNS. They can regenerate if the axon is damaged, but the soma is not. Most nerves are mixed, sensory and motor neurons, somatic and visceral neurons. Tracts, however, are located inside the CNS and cannot regenerate if damaged. The neurons in tracts are separated into their functional groups: somatic sensory tracts versus visceral sensory tracts, somatic motor tracts versus autonomic tracts. Okay, the next part is about the cerebral cortex. Question number 1. List and briefly describe the 4 generalizations regarding the cerebral cortex. Answer number 1. The first generalization of the cerebral cortex states that there are 3 kinds of functional areas: motor, which controls voluntary movement; sensory, which is the conscious awareness of sensation; and association, which is the integration of information of many areas for purposeful action. All the neurons here are interneurons. The second generalization is that each hemisphere has contralateral control of the body for sensory and motor neurons, with the exception of speech muscles. The third generalization is that the hemispheres are equal in structure but not function. Lateralization or specialization of cortical functions occurs here. Finally, no functional area of the cortex acts alone. The information received in class is an oversimplification. Question number 2. Explain how and why the map of the body is distorted on the primary motor cortex. Answer number 2. The map of the body dedicated to motor processing on the primary motor cortex, the motor homunculus, is distorted. The entire body is represented spatially on the cortex and is organized so that the body is upside down. Body parts needing more precise control take up more space on the cortex. A large number of neurons are needed here, which means that it requires more space. For example, muscles in the face and hands need precise control. Each neuron controls a small number of muscle cells within the muscle. The back and torso, for example, do not need the same level of control. Thus, they do not take up as much space on the cortex. A smaller number of neurons are needed here, so each neuron controls a larger number of muscle cells. Question number 3. Explain how and why the map of the body is distorted on the primary somatosensory cortex. Answer number 3. The map of the body dedicated to sensory processing on the primary somatosensory cortex, sensory homunculus, is distorted. It is represented contralaterally and upside down. Areas that are more sensitive, such as the hands and face, have a higher density of sensory receptors. A sensory neuron leaves each receptor to go to the cortex. More neurons going to these areas of the somatosensory cortex means the body parts take up more space. Oppositely, areas that are less sensitive take up less space, such as the back. Fewer neurons go to the areas of the somatosensory cortex, which means that body parts take up less space. Those body parts take up less space. Question number 4. Where is the insula located? What functional areas are located on the cerebral cortex? Answer number 4. The insula is embedded within the lateral sulcus. It acts as the 5th lobe of the brain. The main functional areas on the cerebral cortex are sensory, motor, and association. And the next part is a table. So it's organized where there's the cortex area, which I will read first, and then the functions and relevant connections of each cortex area. So the first cortex area is the primary motor cortex. Its function is to consciously control precise or skilled voluntary movements of skeletal muscles through contraction, which is achieved through pyramidal cells / tracts, aka cortical spinal tracts. Location: the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe of each hemisphere. Next, the premotor cortex. Function: controls learned repetitive motor skills, typing, playing piano, etc. Memory bank for skilled motor movements, and controls voluntary action dependent on sensory feedback. The location: anterior to precentral gyrus and frontal lobe. Connections: the primary motor cortex coordinates movement of several muscle groups. Next is the frontal eye field. Its function: controls voluntary movement of eyes. Location: superior to Broca's area, anterior to premotor cortex. Connections: The primary motor cortex controls eye muscles. Next is Broca's area. Function: speech production, planning speech, and plans other voluntary motor activities. Location: inferior to frontal eye field, left hemisphere. Connections: primary motor cortex controls muscles of tongue, throat, and lips. The next one is the primary somatosensory cortex. Function: spatial discrimination, in which it identifies areas of skin being stimulated and limb location in space, as well as perceiving light, touch, pressure, temperature, stretch, and pain. Location: post-central gyrus. Connections: receives info from receptors in skin, muscles, and joints. The somatosensory association area sends input here for integration. Damage: lose sensation of touch and inability to locate limbs in space. Next is the somatosensory association area. Function: integrate and analyze input so you know what you are feeling. Size, texture, temperature, and relationship of body parts, and stores memories based on past sensory experiences. Location: posterior to superior primary cortex. Connections: primary somatosensory cortex receives sensory inputs for further integration. Damage: can't recognize object by touch. You have to look at them. Can be relearned if you haven't entirely damaged this area. Primary visual cortex. Function: creates map of visual space, color, contrast, depth, and brightness. Location: posterior tip of the occipital lobe. Connections: receives visual info from retina and eyes and the visual association area. Sends in sensory info here for further interpretation. Damage: complete blindness. Visual association area. Function: uses past visual experiences to interpret visual stimuli, color, form, movement, and visual memory. Location: surrounds primary visual cortex, covers much of occipital lobe. Connections: primary visual cortex receives sensory input that it interprets. Damage: you can see but have difficulty recognizing what you are seeing. Next is the primary auditory cortex. Function: interprets sound energy as pitch, rhythm, loudness, and location. Location: temporal lobe, touching lateral sulcus. Connections: receives sensory input from ears and cochlear receptors. The auditory association area sends input here for further interpretation. Damage: deaf. Next is the auditory association area. Function: identify what you are hearing as speech, music, etc. Sound memory stored here. Location: more posterior than primary auditory cortex. Connections: primary auditory cortex receives sensory input for further interpretation. Damage: have difficulty understanding meaning of different sounds. Hard to differentiate meaning between alarm clock versus cell phone ringing versus fire alarm. Next is the olfactory cortex. Function: conscious awareness of different odors. Location: medial aspects of temporal lobe and piriform lobe. Connections: afferent fibers from smell receptors in superior nasal cavities send impulses along olfactory bulbs to olfactory cortex. Other: part of old rhinencephalon. Included all parts of cerebrum that receive olfactory signals, more elaborate olfactory system. Old rhinencephalon taken on new functions such as emotion and memory, acts as part of the limbic system now. Damage: loss of smell. Next is the gustatory cortex. Function: perception of taste stimuli as sweet, sour, salty, bitter, or umami, which is savory or fatty. Location: in the insula just deep to temporal lobe. Connections: receives sensory info from receptors in tongue and cheeks, most located on taste buds, Food must be dissolved in saliva in order to taste. Next is the vestibular cortex. Function: conscious awareness of balance, position of head in space. Location: the insula. Connections: receives input from fluid-filled semicircular canals. Next is the visceral sensory cortex. Function: conscious perception of visceral sensations. Location: the insula. Connections: receives input from sensory neurons in visceral organs. Next is the anterior association area, or the prefrontal cortex. Function: intellect and complex learning, personality, concern for others, planning and persistence, and judgment. Prolonged instant gratification for long-term gratification. Location: frontal lobe. Connections: limbic system. Other: matures very slowly, dependent on positive and negative feedback from societal environment. Damage: mood swings, loss of attentiveness, loss of inhibitions, loss of judgment, disregard for social constraints. Next is the posterior association area, or the general interpretation area. Function: storage site for complex memories associated with sensation. Integrates all sensory information into a single thought. Recognizes faces and patterns. Localize us and surroundings in space. Attention to space, attention to an area of one's body. Location: large area with parts in temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. Connections: receives input from all sensory association areas. Damage: can assess the situation, i.e., you hear loud beeping, see flashing lights outside, and the back of the door is hot, but you can't put together that the house is on fire. Can't recognize old faces or learn new ones. Don't recognize your body as belonging to you, so you won't dress or wash opposite side of the lesion. Wernicke's area. Function: sounding out unfamiliar words and language comprehension, written and spoken. Location: usually found in left hemisphere. Connections: receives neurons from auditory and visual association areas. Broca's area and premotor areas. Sends neurons here. Damage: speak and write in nonsensical language, or word salad. Perfectly able to speak, just can't articulate meaning. Fluent aphasia. Effective language area. Function: allows us to convey nonverbal and emotional parts of language. Comprehend emotion in language. Location: present in one hemisphere opposite Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Connections: auditory association area, visual association area, and the limbic system. Finally, the limbic system. Function: provides emotional impact that makes a scene important to us. Feelings, example, danger. Major memory storage, and odors trigger past memories and emotions. Location: medial surface of each hemisphere, made up of cingulate gyrus, hippocampus, memory, and amygdala, fear and rage. Connections: anterior association area. Finally, there's one last question. You are called on in class to read a passage from your textbook. In sequence, identify the areas of your cerebral cortex used to accomplish this task, and state what each area does to help you accomplish this task. The answer. First, your primary auditory cortex detects that sound is being spoken from the input received from your ears. From there, it sends information to the auditory association area, which allows you to understand that the sound is speech from the teacher. Then, Wernicke's area helps you comprehend what words are being spoken. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for intellect, monitors whether or not you understand this information. From there, the frontal eye field allows you to move your eyes towards the passage in the textbook. This information is sent to the primary visual cortex, which helps create a map of the visual space in front of you. Next, this area communicates with the visual association area, allowing you to recognize and understand what you are seeing. From there, Wernicke's area aids in language comprehension of these words. Then, Broca's area helps in planning and producing speech for these words. This plan is then sent to the premotor cortex, which aids in preparing for for the physical act of speaking. Finally, the primary motor cortex communicates with muscles in the lips, tongue, and throat to produce speech. Thank you for listening.